Welcome to another video, and today's hopefully this isn't quite too long, but there's a lot of stuff that we're going to get through. And what I want to talk about is the ability to create core strength from using functional movements as opposed to isolated abdominal training. And it's something that I speak about quite a lot, and this is where I'm going to show you some interesting EMG studies and statistics to back up some of the claims that I make. It's not that isolated is bad for you, but the benefit from moving correctly is always going to supersede this, and I'll show you why. So for a long time I've discussed using the more functional approach, and a lot of people ask me what's the best way to use my core. I'm not doing enough ab work when we've just done a workout with deadlifts, wood chops and push-ups and Turkish get-ups, and I always say to them, you've already done your core. And they go, but I didn't feel them. This is a big sort of misconception about people always feeling that they need to feel the burn in their abs just like they would with other muscles to feel like they're strengthened and improved, where it's not the case at all. So my argument has always been the activation of the abdominal muscles more consistent with a true function when you're using integrated movements, because it's really more to do with their timing and firing mechanism than their strength. Their strength is not as important to you as you may feel like it needs to be, as it would be, say, with other muscles like the glutes or serratus anterior, things like that. These muscles are a lot different in how they're designed and how they're meant to function. So this is where strengthening of them can actually make things worse and even make you weaker. So this is where I put down the bottom argument against that. My point is that these exercises may not truly strengthen the muscles to the core, they're leaving you exposed to weakness and injury. So why people, like I mentioned a minute ago, because they can't feel their abs burning during a squat or the deadlift, they don't think they're working, and so they think, oh well, I feel them burning on a plank, so the plank must be superior to the squat and the deadlift. That's like thinking of it just like a bicep curl to a bicep to make it stronger, but unfortunately the core doesn't work like that at all. So you really need to understand that there's sort of a combination of what's known as the inner unit, which are your inner abdominal muscles, more concerned with providing stability and have no capacity to move you. So that they must work in combination with the outer unit, which is more like your globalized muscles, more the muscles you can see, so the six-pack muscles, but also part of like your lats, even your glutes, and that are part of the core. So big problems arise when the outer unit believes it's now can do the role of the inner unit, which it cannot, because it doesn't sit close enough to the areas that they control, which is your transverse abdominis, your internal oblique, your multifidus, and your pelvic floor. They're your four key inner unit muscles, which I've labelled here for you. These muscles are very small, can't generate a lot of force, but they're mainly concerned with providing joint stiffness and stability, and these muscles are known as feed forward muscles. So that means that they basically fire before you've even moved. They anticipate you're about to move and provide this stability in the very key area of your spine and pelvis, because if you lose joint alignment and stability in either one of these two areas, whatever movement you decide to produce is going to be greatly compromised. And that's where the outer unit will then come in to provide compensation, which then really becomes a stiffness, or so lack of range of motion. That's where you develop muscle imbalance, trigger points, all these different things. It's just nothing good comes about from that, but it's a reaction to either these muscles not firing early enough or not at all. So this is, sometimes it's like an injury may have resulted that caused that, or maybe that is what caused the injury. It's a bit of the chicken and the egg. So that's the inner unit, which is really driven by the diaphragm here. The diaphragm, which is your breathing. Your breathing sort of instigates and excites all these guys. So if your breathing mechanism is wrong, there's very little chance of you getting these guys to fire right, and then you set off all those chain reactions that we just spoke about. So the outer unit's a little bit more harder to, more difficult to explain, because it's really a lot of your prime movers. So depending on what if you're doing overhead movements, the latissimus dorsi sort of gets more involved. Even the back extensors, your six-pack muscles, your external obliques. So you've got internal oblique working in the inner unit, but the external oblique working in the outer unit. So these muscles are more concerned with providing movement. That's really their main purpose, but they have a dual role in that they also provide stability at times as well. So they assist in stability. The key word there is they assist. They don't actually do it by themselves. They must work in combination with the inner unit. And again, you can see how the breathing is the key on this, which I'll touch on at the end. So how important is the strength of these muscles? So, well, I've mentioned in the beginning, and I've said this many times in videos before, true core stability is about being able to react to perfect reflexes, being able to maintain joint alignment, ready for efficient and smooth movement. And the quote by Vladimir Janda is sort of sums it up. The muscle can be as strong as possible, but if it doesn't fire at the right time, it is useless to you. So, so floor exercises, when you think about what their purpose of them, even the side plank here, I sort of don't mind in some regard, but it provides actually no reflex stability of any kind apart from that when you first get up from the floor. But this isometric holding doesn't really train it to fire earlier or quickly enough. There's really no reflex movement. The rollout does, however, there's some limitations with this, which we'll explain later, where the deadlift requires a massive amount of reflex stability, and not just within the anterior abdominals, but with the hips, the shoulder girdle, how they're maintaining alignment. Even the feet can play a role in this. So these bigger movements really try to really train the core of the inner and outer unit in exactly the way that they were designed to work in the first place. It's not really their strength, because you could have great strength in this but still suck at this. All right, and that's very common to people with back pain. So this is where I put it. Many of the simple require little demand, where these ones require huge demand. So just doing heaps of these won't make any difference to that if you've got a problem within this. Doesn't mean that these aren't useful, but it's just telling you that if you're already good, if you don't have problems and you're okay, I would argue, why are you doing that, and just spend more time here. So, but how much does the core really do in these movements? That's always the question I get asked. So let's have a look at some EMG studies to find that out. Now, firstly, I'll clarify what an EMG is. So it's electromyography. So this is where it basically measures the muscle's response, or its electrical activity in response to the nerve stimulation of the muscle, by inserting little needles, which they call electrodes, through the skin into the muscle. So it doesn't directly measure the muscular tension, it just measures the nervous system's attempt to produce muscular force. So these are pictures of Stuart McGill's stuff with firefighters that he's done before, firefighters with a lot of back pain problems, analysing different movements and seeing what works, and what muscles are firing and when they should fire, and so on and so on. So that's what an EMG means. Now, you need to understand, like when you're looking at these studies, that they often use like a couple of terms. So they'll use what's called a maximum voluntary contraction, so which is abbreviated to MVC. So this is a measurement of how hard a muscle contract isometrically. So in the data, most of the researchers will use the mean, which is like the average of the contraction over the period of the duration of the reps or whatever they've done to do it with, and so they're usually using an isolation exercise to do this. However, it doesn't provide a true reflection of what happens for some muscles, because some are active through the entire range, but some are not. So so when you're doing like a plank, for example, you'll see a high activation of what we call a peak activation. So the peak activation will tell you what it's like, obviously what its peak is, what its maximum it could achieve. But you also need to look at this mean, because you need to see through the duration what was the average of that. So when you have both of these data, it's more valuable to you, because you can actually compare what's more important, especially when you understand that it's not always about the peak contraction that's important, it's about how long it can last, which we'll touch on in a minute. So So there were several studies, and have a look in the description on this video, because in the article that I wrote about this, I included more than just this one, just because this video would go for like too long. I didn't include the other ones, but this one is probably the one that gave me the most information, because it looked at over 50 exercises of combination of integrated and isolated, and used a weight that was light enough to perform at least 5 reps. So because he had some weighted squats and weighted suitcase carry, weighted deadlifts. So you can see here 35-pound squat, but he had like a deadlift of 200-pound, which is quite a big load for most people. So you could see like what it compared with as a body weight and as a weighted one, even chin-ups and things like that. So if you want to, again, check the description under the video, because you can find out Brett Contreras is the guy who completed this study, and it's quite interesting to look at. All right, so what he determined was the winners of his study was for rectus abdominis, the mean was like the average, the chin up, the leg raise, the ab wheel. The peak was the chin up, the leg raise, and the crunch. So the Swiss ball crunch provided a greater activation than the ab wheel. For the internal obliques, you see the ab wheel comes up quite a few times. Body saw, which is sort of similar to the ab wheel really. Body slam, that was another peak one, no surprise there. External obliques, again, leg raises again in there. This is where you start to see a Turkish get-up involved in this one. Cable lifts and stuff, these are probably more where extensions required. So, quite interesting sort of look at this. But what I wanted to really see was how some of these, again, I'm not really so concerned about the peak activation, I'm more concerned about the mean. So just because, this is where it comes back to what we spoke about before, just because you don't feel the burn in the abs in the deadlift doesn't mean they're not working at full capacity. So in this regard, so you can have a look at these, comparing this to the plank. So I could have compared this to the ab wheel or the leg raise. It doesn't really matter. I just use the plank and the deadlift because most people have problems with back pain in the bending action, and they then have been told I've got a weak core to use a plank to correct it. Now, when you look at the results of this, this is for a heavy deadlift, by the way. You can have a look at this, see the rectus abdominis activation versus the plank. The internal oblique and the external oblique, pretty similar in both of these two, but have a look at the lumbar erectors. There's almost zero, almost nothing on the plank, but there's a huge requirement here. So even though that this might have some pretty high in the external obliques than this one, I would still rate this one way superior to whatever is going on there, because I get a combination of all the muscles, not just a handful, and it's always the anterior ones that were working. So the posterior extension are getting absolutely no work at all, and also there's no movement. That you're not learning any firing or reflex stability like we've spoken about a few times. So there's the first comparison. There's a bigger slide for you if you couldn't see those numbers correctly. Alright, so if I move on to the next one, Turkish get up versus the side plank, because they're very similar. Obviously this one doesn't move, and this one has a gazillion pieces that have to be sort of executed perfectly. The side plank is one of the ones that I do, along with probably the horse dance or bird dog, some people call it. This one actually rates quite well, because you can see here it has, compared to the plank, the traditional plank, actually rates quite well in the lumbar erector region as well. But when you compare it to the Turkish get-up, it doesn't even come close. So it's interesting, out of the entire study of the exercise, the Turkish get-up was the only exercise that had over 100% peak activation in all 4 core muscles. It was the only one out of all of them that could do that. So I've said this for a long time, that this is the king of all the core exercises, and this just proves it. And this doesn't even take into consideration where you need hip mobility, thoracic mobility. You don't need either of those two things in this. They're huge requirements to be even able to generate the strength. All right, so there's a expanded picture for you if you couldn't see the numbers very clearly. Again, go to the article, because you'll see it better in their website article in the description below. Front squat versus the ab wheel. Well, the ab wheel we saw rated quite well, and you can see in terms of peak activation it was quite high, especially from the feet. No surprise there, but even the kneeling one, that's extremely high. But again, to take a look at the lumbar erector work here, very consistent with the traditional plank, almost nothing. All right, comparison to the front squat. Have a look at the front squat lumbar erector work here versus that. Like, sure, the lower abdominals and the obliques are much less, but the demands across the board are significantly greater. It's not just honing in on one thing. Anyone who does a lot of heavy front squats will know exactly how hard it is to breathe during that exercise, how much it feels like your core is absolutely on its limit. Definitely on its limit here, but nowhere near as much of a threat to your spine as this one is. So again, I would rate this one way better just for the fact it balances the workload of the abs versus the lumbar erectors, and it gives me a total wrapping around feeling of the core as opposed to just honing in on the rectus abdominis with a massive overload. There's the expanded picture for you if you couldn't see the numbers clearly. Last one I'll look at, I could have looked at heaps of them, but again this video will go for too long. Chin-ups versus leg raises, very, very similar movement. Arguably it is an integrated exercise because you do need some grip strength, lat strength to hang on to the bar for a period of time doing leg raise. So it is arguably integrated, not purely isolated like the other ones. I probably could have maybe compared the leg lift as an example, but interestingly, the chin-up itself, the level of rectus abdominal beat any other abdominal exercise. Weighted exercises in mean and peak rectus abdominis activity. You can see that here. So the chin-up itself was the highest for abdominal control, which is interesting, and it's interesting that it beats the one that is known for doing it. So really, you would argue, why am I bothering doing that? I may as well do this because I get so much more benefit to the other things as well. But once again, you can actually see even on the lumbar erector work on the chin-up versus the leg raise, again, it's significantly different. One thing to notice is like the weighted chin-up was actually less than the body weight chin-up. So if you're using weights or weight vests on a chin-up, I wouldn't bother if you're wanting to do it for improve your core activity, because you're going to get more out of the body weight one, which is quite amazing. There's the numbers there if you couldn't see them clearly before. All right, so there's several examples. Like I said, I could keep going and going, but things that you've got to keep in mind with this testing is while it gives you great insights into various exercises, it does have limitations with the study. Firstly, the isolated exercises obviously have a massive advantage in terms of the EMG in the specific area that you're targeting. So like the rectus abdominis is going to get significantly greater activation because that's the only thing that's really moving. Where it's really just trying to stay in a stabilizing role and assisting in the movement. So it's where like there has a huge advantage in that. That's why you can't just look at the peak one. You need the mean results to see as well. So that's where I put here like weighted exercise, like the weighted crunch, for example, will always have massive activation, where the wood chops and single cable press will have lower, but it doesn't mean they're not working. It just means that they're actually trying to move the forces away from the spine instead of putting it into very much sort of honing it into the trunk like a crunch. This is actually trying to get the load out away from the spine and put it into the arms and legs. So this is something you've got to keep in mind. Also put here like things to keep in mind that for the isometric ones like the planks, they're really, because they're not moving at all, there's no real periods of reduced muscular activity at the start or the end. So they're highly activated all the way through, whereas say like the get up will have a point where it is, but then it'll disappear, so that the average will sort of be lower, but it doesn't mean that it wasn't working hard at certain points. That's why the peak is also relevant to look at, because the peak is going to be greater on this than this, but over the average this will be lower than that, and so on and so on. So but this just shows you just how great the Turkish get-up is, because even with its distinctive disadvantage, it actually still recorded better than all of the other exercises in the entire study. The last thing to keep in mind is the inner unit. So all of those muscles that were tested didn't test any of these. All we got to see was the outer unit ones. So they're good to look at, but we didn't really see the level of activation of these, which, as we discussed at the beginning, are extremely important. So there are studies that did do this, but they're a little bit too complicated for me to go in this video. Again, it's in that website article. One study that sort of did start to look at some of these Again, the link is in the description below, and they started to look at other things like glutes and everything as well. They performed a study on 19 males and 11 females doing these 9 different exercises. So you can see some of them are lunges and that, and dynamic things, bird dogs, bridges. And what they found was the impact of the side bridge and the quadruped, which is the bird dog, had the best effect for meeting the demands of the core, because it included things like the glutes. So it put it at a distinct advantage over just the purely isolated ones, for that very reason, that it gave them a much more rounded effect of stabilizing the pelvis and spine. So the maximal strength was not the thing that was of importance to them. It was its ability to have a more cross-sectional ability to provide stability instead of just one single muscle area or two, for example. So what does all this mean? So sort of gone quite nerdy here. The isolated exercise undoubtedly provide some great peak activation for one or even two muscles, but they do not provide the stabilization of the entire core complex. So while it sounds like the obvious thing to say that, many people are still caught in the illusion of trying to strengthen the muscles. Remember, we spoke about the bicep curl at the start. They just have this belief that if they make this muscle stronger and it's in their core region, their core is now stronger, when it's actually probably becoming weaker because they're not balancing it out together. I would rate this rollout way better than the sit-up. At least this doesn't provide horrible postural concerns, but I wouldn't rate this as good as the deadlift or the squat. All right, so strength is irrelevant if you continue to move poorly. So the way the muscles interact with their synergistic partners is more value to your body than their strength alone. It's their poor interaction that leads to weakness, compensation, injury, and eventually pain. So these are examples of a poor deadlift. So incredible abdominal strength is of absolutely no value to you right now. You are still going to get a herniated disc from doing something like this. You're going to have all types of problems no matter how strong your abs. Your abs may be too strong, which may be the problem. And this is another example here. So lacking hip mobility, lacking thoracic mobility, poor brain coordination. Maybe you do have mobility, it's just you don't understand how to move well. You'll never be able to get good strength from this. So that's just in a simple bending action. This would be like the Trendelenburg type things that we see, lateral pelvic tilt. A lot of things that, so foot and all sorts of things are going on here. But to just think a side plank is going to resolve this, you're dreaming. There's a lot more things involved with that. The strength of the muscles is going to be instantly sacrificed to overcome the compensations at other areas. You really need to learn how to correct the other areas, and the abdominals will be able to do what they're meant to do. So are the ab exercises useless? No, they're definitely useful. They're definitely needed. Sometimes you just cannot do a bending exercise. There's too much pain. There's too much dysfunction. You have to regress it. Some of these exercises are a useful stepping stone to get back to learning these. So the key is, and I put here, the intention of transferring the strength to the integrated movements is what you need to have. If you have no intention of trying to do this, they are useless to you. They're really not going to change anything at all. All right. If anything, they'll probably just continue to make things worse. Always remember, it's within these patterns that you really change things for the long run. And if you're already able to do these, there's really no need to do them as often as you need. You could probably complement them, but I wouldn't waste so much time with them. So how much strength is needed? Well, when a muscle contracts, it creates both force and stiffness. While stiffness is a good thing, too much can be a problem. If a muscle becomes more active, it usually can add to spinal stability, but if it keeps working, it actually reduces your motion, and inevitably spinal stability is compromised by giving you a buckling effect. So this would be an example of someone who's done way too many abdominal crunches or way too many ab wheels or leg raises or whatever, and now they're actually compromised their spinal stability from the very thing they thought that was going to correct them. Now they're going to get a disc bulge from the very exercise they were using that they thought were going to prevent them from it. All right, so you can see how too much stiffness is no good to you. You just need a certain amount, but not too much. And this is where, if you were doing things that were balancing you out and you had their lumbar erectors working, you would have maintained that posture. So McGill's done research into this, and this is a picture of his firefighter study that he's done before. And he found, ironically, that only a modest amount of strength was required to maintain sufficient stability of the lumbar spine. So his research established that to maintain a safe amount of stability in most of the daily tasks, it was important to have great muscle endurance more than the peak individual strength. Remember, we spoke about that in those EMG studies before. That's why you need to look at both of them. So having strong abdominal muscles did not seem to provide the stability effect they were looking for, yet muscular endurance did. That was what, because basically if you could be strong, but if you only last like 10 or 30 seconds, it's no good to you. So people say, well, the plank's really good for me then. I can do 2 minutes of planks. May not actually help you at all when you're doing a deadlift, because it doesn't know how to time itself, it doesn't fire fast enough, and it may not last long enough in that movement with the combination of inner and outer core. Alright, so you can see how it gets quite confusing. So he found that the amount of strength required was on average about 10% of maximum of the MVC, so depending on the task. So however, several factors that must happen if you want to achieve that. So firstly, the muscle's ability to fire fast enough, and secondly, the co-contraction of the abdominals and extensors, which we spoke about both of these several times in this video, and the muscle's ability to maintain strength for long periods. So it needed three things. You needed to fire fast enough, you needed to have co-contraction of all of them, not just one or two, and they needed to have the ability to maintain strength for long periods. If you're able to do that, they're very sort of unlikely to develop injury or pain, move very efficiently, and develop quite strength quite easily. So the secret to getting your core strength, really, and I'm sort of just whipping through this last bit because this video is going too long already. The secret is really, you've got to improve your mobility. I haven't really discussed any of this. You can check it again, check the description under the video. There's heaps of links to go into more detail on this, and there's hundreds of videos done on this before. So improving your mobility, if we're talking about the core, we're really looking at the hip and the thoracic region. Both of those areas sort of compromise your ability to create stiffness in the lumbar region immensely. Secondly, improve your movement strategy, so that's more of a brain and a neural thing. Thirdly, improve the way you breathe, and more specifically how you brace your core. So, and I've got here, like this is an example of I've used this from other videos before, where if the stabilizer is too late in firing here, then it's all going to go pear-shaped on you. If the hip and thoracic weren't able to put you in a good alignment to start with, before you've even lifted that bar, you're already compromised. So so there's several things that are going on here that really provide the strength and the secret of getting your core strength. If you've got any questions or comments, feel free to chuck them in below, and I'll get back to you if I can. I aim to get back to most people as soon as I can. But yeah, make sure you check out the description, and and if you need help with other things, there's great reports that we have with back pain, functional training, shoulders, lots of stuff that can go into more detail on what to do for improving all of this. But I hope you've enjoyed that video, and we'll see you on the next one.